Chit Chat is sponsored by Fun Again Games, where everyone is welcome at our table, and your source for hard-to-find imports, liquidation games, new releases, and much more. Be sure to visit funagain.com to check it out. On episode 111 of Chit Chat, we talk about the ups and downs of player count and why it matters. Can it really play solo, or at 2, or at 6? All we know is there's 3 of us here today, and we're ready to talk about games and maybe even search for the lost species. Welcome back to Chit Chat. It is episode 111, and today we are here to talk about player count. And you're probably saying, player count, yeah, people play games. It's either 1, maybe 4. I mean, you play a lot of solo, but we're talking about specifically player count as it relates to when maybe does it not work? When does a game say, hey, you can play up to this, but really it's best at 2? Or it says you can play up to 5, but it is a nightmare to play at 5, or something like that.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about games we've been playing. I'd like to say we have a winner from last episode, but we didn't give away anything last episode.
That's true, we didn't actually.
However, we are giving something away this episode, and that is a copy of Rear Window. If you've watched the channel at all, you've seen Ryan at least.
I've very much talked about Rear Window.
I want to play this game. So,
you haven't tried it
Yeah, I
yet?
have not played it.
It's
It
playing.
It is an interesting game. It's based on an IP that I would have never expected to hit board games in this day and age.
Right.
But Funko Games made this game, and we'll be giving it away. What should the code word be?
Hitchcock, right there.
Oh.
Code word Hitchcock.
Hitchcock is the code word, so use that. Email mvmcontest@gmail.com with that in the subject line, and you'll be entered to win a copy. So let's start talking about player count. What's a game you've played recently? I have a couple recently that I've played where player count definitely had some impact.
I wanted to start by saying I'm a grump. I'm grumpy about this. I don't like playing games at less than the max player count. I don't like when people play game. I don't enjoy playing big games at 2 players.
Okay.
I think that it changes the experience so dramatically that people that tell me that they hated a game that they put at 2 players, a game that requires a lot of player interaction. I like playing games at max player count. But what you said earlier in the intro is true. Some games where they tack on, they say this game can play up to 6. They don't really feel like 6-player games.
Well, and some do. And maybe this comes down to your tastes of what player counts you like. I mean, that may be a separate topic, but I don't like max player count, just generally speaking, because it just almost always makes the game longer and drags it out a lot more. But there are games like Seven Wonders that I feel is perfectly great at 7 players.
And so the big one for me is that you have certain mechanics that lend themselves to that stuff. So like drafting game, you want to have as many people as possible. Or Seven Wonders, or one of my favorite games, Paper Tales. You want people next to you. You want more people to be next to other people so that I can fight you over here, you can fight me over there. So I definitely get that. For me, I have the same issue that you do. So what I tell people, when we have a game that's 2 to 5, there's also kind of this hidden language where sometimes they don't tell you the 2 players a variant.
Yeah.
And that variant can change the entire experience. Whereas if you do play it at 5, it may make the game feel a little long, and they just want to express the fact that you could play it 5-player. So that's a little bit of the deception trick that comes in on these boxes. And I would implore publishers to maybe establish something that says there's a variant, just like I have to deal with when I have my 1 player. Sometimes they're so much drastically of a different experience. Or if, in a 2-player situation where they have an additional dummy player, those types of things are really not as attractive to people, and they don't find that out until they get the box. And for most people who don't research all the time, they're going to be kind of they feel deceived by that. It's I don't want to add a 3rd player or do extra work. I want a choice of whether I want that, and if I have to, there's a couple of certain games that do that. It's not necessarily a turn on.
No, and I really appreciate publishers that stick to a player count and say this game is 3 to 4 players. And we've seen games like that where they literally minimum player count is 3. They didn't try to put a 1-player mode.
And I think it should not be a turnoff. It's very honest. It's hey, this is a 3 to 4 player game. Deal with the devil that I just played. That is a 4-player game.
Period.
Don't skirt around it. You cannot submit for the extra roll. You're literally giving things, and the thing is keeping track of like where it goes to who. And if you have to figure out where the fourth one goes, you're like, wait, who's being the acting person for this?
Yeah.
Like, and people say that's a turnoff, and I'm like, but if you have
honest.
4 people, this is going to be a game where you play when 4 people are coming over. You got to say that. As many games that we buy and have extra, this is going to be the one where we have a 4-player night. And just let it be that. But like, I do see that in game groups. How does it play with 2? How does it play with 2? Because there's a lot of couples, people who play with their son or daughter.
For sure.
And they don't have a game group. They may every once in a while have 3. And it is just kind of a stickler point for me. It's just like when I see 2 to 5 players, I don't think a 2-player experience is going to be good.
That's exactly right. I'm so jaded by that.
Yeah.
And my first thought is like, no, I don't want to play this game at 2. Yeah. We play a lot of games at 2 players because it's, we're testing out. Right. Yeah. To try them out. I don't even know how many times that we've sat and had an experience where we're like, that experience felt kind of meh. That would have been so much better at 4 players.
Or even if it didn't feel meh, we can very easily recognize why and how it would feel different at more players. Because you can play a 2-player game and you're like, you know what, it feels like we're probably missing out on this. Mm-hmm. Like, in fact, we talked about this recently. Emily and I played Mille Fiore. Yeah. And we played it at 2-player the first time. Had a perfectly pleasant time playing it. We said this on the last episode of Chit Chat. And then we learned how much more fun it was at 4 players. And this is a 2 to 4 player game. Yeah. It's a drafting game, and it really kind of boils down to that. But it also has a lot of different areas on the board that you're impacting with the drafting. And it's really that, even more so than the drafting, that feels so much different because there's just a lot more play. Yeah. It's not area control, but there's a lot of fighting for positioning of your little pieces on the board all over the place. And then we realized, and you'd mentioned 2-player variants, this rule book doesn't have a 2-player variant.
Right.
But a 2-player variant existed. And when we played that, it did address a lot of the things that we thought was maybe flawed with a 2-player game. But like I said, the first time we played it at 2-player, we still had a lot of fun playing it. It was just after we played at 4, we found out, oh, wow. It's so much better at 4 players.
I think that's a problem with a lot of games when you play a 4-player game that needs 4 players at 2, and you realize there's no one blocking your strategy. The game just becomes so loose, and you're like, even especially like area control games or games with multiple tracks. Yeah. It's like, oh, you're going up that track? I'm going to go up this track.
I was just about to say
that. We'll never meet, and we'll never have to compete with each other. We just, in a 2-player game, you just kind of do your own thing. Yeah. Now, that's not saying that there's never been a 4-player game that's great at 2. Right. Grand Austria Hotel plays phenomenally.
Castles of Burgundy is a great 2-player game. Yeah. Seasons is a better 2-player game.
But even Castles of Burgundy is better at 4 for me because there's more options on the board, more tiles come out in a 2-player game. Like we played, and you hate drafted those cows away from me.
Yeah.
In a 4-player game, that's less likely to happen because there's more choices. There's more tiles out on the board to choose from.
I like, and on the other end of that, like, of course, I feel like we're talking about multiplayer solitaire type games. There's also that part, but
and 2-player games. Right. The reason you don't like 2-player games that you're describing, I think if you're a multiplayer solitaire player, you don't mind that.
You don't mind
I don't mind that. I don't mind us going in our own channels, but I do recognize, like with Mille Fiore, it was more fun to interact with each other's channels.
I just think there's a lot of games where people go like it was a dud. There's no this and no that, and I'm like, usually it's a multiplayer solitaire game, and there's not enough people at the table to excite you and have conversation and to experience the game with you, and maybe open up the game more because you get to see more of the board. Like Encyclopedia. So this is a recent game that just came out. I try to stick with the recent games. So like you're playing this game, and there's really there's opportunities for interaction, but you really only have the other person's dice pool. Well, if you're really non-interactive people, then you don't really get in each other's die. You're like, I'll do my thing over here with my dice. Maybe I'll take that one die because I definitely need it that one time. But that's all the interaction you get. Whereas if there's 3 or 4 people there, now we're like looking at everybody's die like, ooh, I should probably
so many to choose
take
from.
that. Oh, I got that to take and that to take. And then you get the true experience of what the design was meant to do. And there's now new added pressure. The board is fully exposed. Like now there's not like, well, if you were playing 3-player, you would have this spot and this spot. And you're like, God, man, we don't really even have that many choices. You don't get to see as many tiles.
Right.
You don't, so there's a thing about, and I know we're harping on this low player count thing, but it's just like, that's where you get on the lower ends, your options are already restricted for balance purposes. But I mean, if it makes it tough on a lot of products when I don't know what the 2-player is like. And I think people are less worried about how high a player count is. I think they're worried about the low player count. Is it good? Is it strong?
And even if it's good, like we just played Wayfarers of the South Tigris, which played okay at 2.
Yeah.
But at 4 players, you get so many more options.
Right.
There's so many more workers in play that you could draw these different workers. And also games like that where you have rows of cards in a 2-player game, and like Dune Imperium, anything like that, where you only have 2 people drawing from that deck, it's way less likely to cycle through. And if you've got 4 players, you're way more likely to actually get through those decks and see some of those cards.
That's an interesting point too. We just played another game recently, Oros, which it does a great job, in my opinion, of adding that sort of Automa player, which I think a lot of times when people hear, oh, you have to play with an Automa at 2. And in Oros you do. If you're playing at 2 players, you have to add at least one. And you can add even another one if you want. And it's beautiful, in my opinion, the way that works. I don't use a lot of Automa. Probably you do more.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah,
but it's very elegant the way that works, I think, and it's necessary in that game because of the board state needing to change.
Yep.
Like in a game like Wayfarers, you can still technically play because even though the cards aren't like cycling, they're the cards. You can get a card. In Oros, the board state changes so much because there's this collision of tiles and raising of tiles and numbers. It has to be affected by more players than just 2 for the game to work the way it needs to work. And that one does a great job of that. I think Heat is another example where you could play. It plays up to 6 players, and you can do that with solo. You could have 7 legends playing with 6.
5 to make 6
I guess
players.
you could do all 7.
Well, you could.
But you could have 6 other legends, which are basically the Automa, playing along with you.
And I like seeing that trend in games like Heat and Oros. Like they make it so you can still get that full 6-player experience, the full player count experience, because Heat is a racing game, and you want that full racing experience. Even at 3 players, you could add 3 legends and still get that 6-player experience.
With that said, 3 players was fun.
It still is fun.
We had fun at 3.
You also have a set of complicated rules, so I'll just highlight how solo and co-ops work. So with that Automa that I'm talking about, it depends on how much upkeep there is, because sometimes there's so many different rules, and you're maybe not used to playing solo or anything. You don't know how that works, so mechanically it's a fail, And then all of a sudden that game is a fail when it has mechanics that you like, because you had to do this Ultima guy at 2 players.
And it was a little fiddly.
That's what I'm saying. So with solo and co-ops, it's different. Like solo now has Ultima cards, stopping spaces. So like just adding people to spaces, and you're restricted. Less cards, ticking time bomb, interactions. It also has apps now, so the apps are more prevalent. So you can play on your own, and the apps doing kind of like stuff in the background, like Dune. But then you also have this co-op situation where player count truly matters. You got a lot of these dungeon crawlers, some that play very quick and fast, even at 4 players. And then you have games that are like big campaign games where you could play with your group at 4. But a lot of these can be played at like 1 and 2 players. And in some cases, as these games get bigger and bigger and more thematic, 2 players is like all I want to deal with. That's the reason why I play most of these games by myself, because I control all this stuff. I control how many players I want for upkeep. And that's the thing with among solo players. Like how many? Gloomhaven, I did 3 and did almost a full campaign like that. Or Kingdom of Death Monster, I have to control 4. Now there are games that have done good jobs like that. Most recently, Oathsworn, you have like kind of a smaller version of the characters, and they're just condensed, and you move 2 pieces, and that's your actions. That's like the most optimal situation I've never had. But if you're talking about like Gloomhaven, you're going to full on hands, and you got to figure that out. If you're talking, like Kingdom of Death Monster, 4 full characters that you have to do. And those are where things get interesting. And most recently, we were playing ISS Vanguard, and you have like a lot of ship responsibility, and you have to do 2 different guys, and you got these things are going on. And I just, honestly, I don't know if I could stand the game with more than myself and my buddy.
Yeah, I feel the same way, maybe similar to ISS Vanguard, about things like the Orange Nebula game.
Yes.
Unsettled.
Unsettled, yeah.
I feel that way about Arkham Horror, personally.
Yeah.
Because I think the card game. Arkham Horror, the card game, I think I prefer at 2 players just because it's a more digestible thing for me. There's not as there's too many variables, I think, when you're playing something like that. For me personally. One other point I wanted to make recently: Massive Darkness 2 has some interesting things going on, and I'm not sure where they balanced it when they designed the game. But that game has an interesting thing because the player count has a significant impact on the size of a mob that comes out.
It's crazy.
You spawn a mob in this game, and it comes with a leader, effectively, and then 1 grunt for each player that's in the game. Now, that mob then rolls dice when you're attacking it even that scales with all those grunts.
Yes.
So you're rolling a black die for each of the grunts plus a die associated with the leader's card.
Yeah.
And if you're playing full complement of players, which I think might be 5 players in Massive Darkness.
I think so.
Even at 4, you're rolling dice that could kill you.
Right.
Which feels like a little weird. It's a reason why I'll never play Massive Darkness 2 at more than 2, maybe 3. But that game is significantly more difficult, and there's nothing that I saw that the game does to adjust for that.
It's just
it can kill you. Yeah. Your hit points aren't any higher. The mobs are just going to necessarily be harder, and I think they were thinking, well, but there's more people to attack them. But when you're facing down with them, and you're just by yourself, so it's all coming at you, and you could roll badly and just flat out die.
I mean, cooperative games are a tough one for me.
Tricky.
Now,
Very tricky.
Competitive games, I stand by what I said. I like to play max player count. Cooperative games, it's tough, right? Because you're right. Maybe it's easier to manage at lower player counts, but you do miss out on some of the interactions that you have. Like Pandemic, for example, which is a classic co-op game. When you're playing with 2 players, it works really well, but you have 2 roles, you have 2 powers.
Right.
In a 4-player game, you have 4 powers. And the game becomes different, but you have more things to do, you can spread out and cover the map more, and you can interact in different ways. Marvel Champions is kind of the same way. People don't like to play Marvel Champions at 4 because it becomes so much longer. Like when I play Marvel Champions solo, I play that game in 20 to 30 minutes. 4-player game is like 2 hours. Right. But you see interactions and moments in a 4-player game that you will never see when you're playing solo.
Yeah, that's true. But I'd be interested. What's your favorite player count on that game?
Honestly, for me, I played 2-player. 2-player is my favorite.
2-player seems like the sweet spot.
But cooperative games are always different. I'm with you. I mean, it's just easier to manage 2 players.
And I would say at this point, one of the things that, and I know it's a kind of a point of contention for our gamers, but I honestly feel like the introduction of apps with these foreteller apps and just generally how the apps are made nowadays. Lord of the Rings, Descent, even Destinies, even though I don't like the solo in that one, they create the theme for you. They read the stories for you. So it does make things more thematic and deeply entrenched, so you don't have to have a higher player count. You don't have to worry about reading challenges. So there is a point where sometimes something like technology can enhance the experience and also have a lot less lifting for the players, which I think is something that is really winning these, getting people to buy a lot of these bigger box games now because they have those experiences to use.
I think those big box experiences, the miniatures games, the big thematic campaign games, it's a different story than when you're talking about playing, a competitive Euro at 2 players versus 4 players, right?
Definitely.
I do really, really appreciate when a game that's multiplayer plays well at 2. Yeah. But also at the same time, I think there are so many phenomenal 2-player games that are designed specifically to be at 2 players that I often say, well, yeah, sure, I could play, Teletum at 2, or I could play Beer and Bread, which was designed for 2 and just works perfectly at 2 players.
I just thought of this, and it's like there's also those people who are like, I always have big game nights. I have 5 people. And every once in a while when I do have a game night, I'll say, hey, tonight is the game night where we're going to have 5 or 6 people. We're going to play 5-player games. We're going to play 6-player games. And I feel like you got to have that in the chamber. Like I was disappointed. I was disappointed by Libertalia, but I was trying to keep it because it was like one of the only games I could play at 6 players. That was like within an hour, 6 players. And I was like, it's decent enough. But, maybe I want to play Monstrosity instead. Like you do have to have that ability. And I think like Rolling Rights do that really well. It's like, hey, this can play a lot of player counts. But I don't know. it's just interesting that like higher player count can also be a challenge because a lot of games are 2 to 4 players.
Anything that I think is solo multiplayer or like multiplayer solitaire, like you described, are fine at any player count. Guild of Merchant Explorers, I play it too all the time, but that is kind of solo multiplayer. You're not really interacting with anybody else. You're just, it doesn't matter how many players are playing the game. Your experience doesn't change. But like Hadrian's Wall, for example, which is a roll and write, if you're playing at 4 players, you just have more options at the table, more people to trade with, more people to trade with you. And so you can actually do a little bit more in a 4-player game than you could ever do playing that game in 2. Now, that's maybe not the best example because it does still play really well at 2. Yeah. But I think that's the exception, not the rule with those kind of games.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention as it relates to cooperative games and player count, one reason I lean towards 2, because that's kind of one of the things we were talking about just now, is I think when there's 4 people at the table and you've got that one person who's kind of commanding things.
Oh, the alpha gamer?
The alpha gamer or the quarterback. And I don't know that I'd classify myself as an alpha gamer or a quarterback.
I definitely wouldn't.
But if you tend to be sort of the leader of the pack in those sorts of things, you're going to feel more like that in a 4-player setting than you are in a 2-player setting. When I'm in a 2-player setting with someone playing a cooperative game, it feels like we're more of a team, even if one of the persons...
We're having a conversation.
Yeah, we're having a conversation. I'm not just telling you everything to do. It's just the 2 of us. We're in this together. We're figuring it out together. You can feel more like a hive mind where if it's 4 players, one person could be doing that with the one other person at the table that they think is going to give input. And then there's 2 players that are like, are we even playing? So I do think that's one of the reasons why I like 2 players with cooperative games is because you really do feel like a team. Alicia and I even played one of the Pandemic Legacies at 2 players, but we just double-handed.
You each played 2?
We each played 2, which I think, if I remember correctly, there are rules for doing that.
There are rules, at least in base Pandemic. I played all the Pandemic Legacies with 4. So
So I don't want to talk about it forever, but I'll just say like there's also the other end of that. It's like if you were playing Kingdom Death Monster, this is a lifestyle game. You got 4 people. You're raising a society. You know, you're creating a society. You're creating a village. There should be arguments. Everything around you is dark. That's part of the theme. You know, You know, whereas like I will never experience ISS Vanguard with more than 2 players, but I also love the fact that it's like, hey, I'm the ship captain. You know, like I'm the ship captain. I run this department. That kind of thing. So that the conversations is like I have to lean on your choices as best as possible to simulate that, like you have control. And that's just a really interesting conversation. Always with cooperatives, it's always an interesting conversation how from different games how that plays out.
Yeah, for sure. If you have any thoughts on player count, any of the games we've talked about, share them in the comments below for sure. We want to talk a little bit more about that. But we just thought it was an interesting topic to discuss because we've played some games recently that had some like, oh, this is much better at 2 even though you can play at 4, or this is much better at 4 and I'll never want to play it at 2 again.
That's mostly me.
And speaking of the games that we've been playing, we have some games that we'd like to discuss that we have been playing. Ryan, do you want to kick things off?
Well, I mean, I've been playing a ton of Rear Window still. I feel like this is another one I talk about in Chit Chat because it's so easy to get to the table. In fact, I was just at a holiday party last night even, and it's a couple.
How many times did you play it last night?
I played it twice. So it's just easy to bring in people and say, okay, well, we're going to play Rear Window really quick. You haven't played this game before, like. You could teach it in 5 minutes. It's just super easy to teach. It's super easy.
And you've called it the Mysterium Killer.
I have called it the Mysterium Killer in the past, and I stand by that. And in fact, some of the people that we played with that had never played said that independently.
Really?
They're like, well, I don't see the need to play Mysterium anymore.
Are you sure you're not sending them like telepathic vibes? Say this is a Mysterium
Killer.
I
may have mentioned Mysterium Killer. No. I mean, it's just, it does feel like that game.
Now, have you, in all the times you've played, have you been teaching new people so that you don't do the murderer thing, or have you done ones where you have the murderer?
I've actually only done the murderer part once.
Were you the director?
I wasn't.
That's another thing we can even talk about is like roles.
Yeah.
Like roles at the table. Because of the dynamic of people you pick to play with or the player count, it's like some people like roles. So that also, 1 to 3 players or mind management where people have to choose roles. And it's like,
that's
the more people you have, how do you choose those things? That's a very interesting conversation.
Rear Window is a great example of that too, because you can play technically 4 players, 1 person giving, or 5 players, 1 person giving the clues and 4 people guessing. But in reality, Any number of people can be on the other side of the screen working together. And when you have more than one person, you get that conversation.
Yeah.
Like Rear Window at 2 players is just me putting out clues and the other person guessing.
Yes.
But at 4 players, or having 4 out there, they're all talking about their theories. They're leading people. Maybe one player notices something that another player didn't. And so it's a much different experience at 4 compared to another game that we've been playing recently, which is Undaunted Stalingrad, which was designed completely as a 2-player experience and is, I think, a phenomenal back and forth two-player experience.
It is it's like chess. It's World War II chess. And we played it on the live stream recently. And these are not my kind of games, typically war games in general. Although I do remember having played the original Undaunted and feeling like, okay, this is a more approachable game. But this one, as we've said on the live stream and at other times, this whole campaign aspect of this one is really interesting and compelling. On the live stream, we played through the first scenario, which is effectively the get to know you scenario. Yes. And then we actually took the steps that you take during the campaign between that scenario and the next one, where you're actually like getting reserves to replace some of your casualties, getting upgraded units.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, that alone, like, oh, I've got this new rifleman that does this.
Yeah,
I know. I'm ready. I want to see. I want to get him into play.
I just bought it, so I'm hyped. It's in plastic right now. So.
That is an interesting one. And we have been playing that one. I mentioned this on another video, but Jeremy and I just played Teletum again, and it was a fantastic experience. It was
at 2.
Yeah, it was one of our 2 players, and it was fantastic. It was on our sort of best of the rest video, so hear more about it then. But the game that we played came down to the very end. We'd both scored 191 points, but he scored one more point from his leftover resources. I had 1 resource, he had 5, and you get 1 point for every 4 resources. Yeah. And he won 192 to 191.
That's crazy.
With wildly different ways of getting there, and I love that about board gaming when that happens.
That was a very good game.
If you haven't tried to let them, give it a go. It does feel like an old Euro, but at the same time, it does some really fun things, and it has unbelievably satisfying turns where you're puzzling it out. And speaking of player count, we were competing with each other, but we were sitting there helping
trying to
each other
figure out how awesome our turns could be.
On his last turn, I shouldn't have helped you on this last turn.
I know, you shouldn't help me. You unlocked how I was going to finish the game.
On his last turn, he had this big move where you can move, was it your merchant? Merchant caravan.
My merchant guy.
8 spaces, I think.
Yeah, I had it down to 8 spaces, so I was like, here comes the big turn.
He had some extras, and he moved, dropped a house, and then he wanted to drop one last house, but also pick up this tile that would let him do a contract. And we were like, wait a minute.
How do we do this?
You're 1 action shy. And then we figured it out. And I was sitting there helping him.
I think you can't help that. In a game like that, like, everyone wants to be involved in the puzzle, even when it's not your turn.
It. Roles once again, like you want to Sherpa people. You want you want them to have fun with you.
Especially if you're the one teaching the game, too. Like, we've talked about this on Chit Chat a lot. You want it to be a good experience. So you could have sat back and just laughed at Jeremy and said, you missed. But being involved, like, it's the worst thing after the fact to be like, you could have beat me if only you did this. Yeah. It's like, why did you say? Like, you could have mentioned that to me. You could have helped me out.
I always stand by the fact that it's better to point out, like, oh, you could do this. Unless the player doesn't want it. If the player hasn't asked for it or has said, hey, don't help me, I want to do it on my own, that's totally something differently. But selfishly, I enjoy participating in the puzzle. And at the same time, I think it helps someone go, oh, wow, that was one hell of a turn I just took.
Right.
And if that's what this game is offering, I want to play it again. So, to let them, it was a great experience.
So I'm going to go with a curveball. This is a game that's not new, but it has a new expansion and just delivered, is Bites. It is one of my favorite family games. It's one of my favorite family games. We had played it at one of our recent meetups because it has a new expansion. So just delivered, new expansion. It adds a whole nother set of wacky things that you can do with this game. But generally, all you're doing is laying out a huge display of different pieces of food. And you have these different colored bugs, and none of them are your bugs. And you're moving across this plane. You can move as far as you want, but you can grab a piece in front of or behind. And the trick to it is that you're trying to collect sets of these pieces. And you're also determining the market depending on how, what ant comes in first, for how many points it's going to score at the end of the game. But the trick to this game is, and this is where the fun comes in. There's a little bit more strategy than you think as far as how this goes in. There's more than meets the eye. But here's the deal: there are character powers. There's character powers. Well, there's not necessarily character powers. There's characters that you can add to the board that have powers. There's abilities that you can trigger by having pieces of candy. There's different scoring conditions, and there's a whole bunch of these cards that does that. Now, the new expansions add like animals, like there's a bird that comes on there.
Oh, wow.
There's like a turtle, like there's all these different like things that go up the track behind you. There's just ways they restrict the movement. There's just so much to this design, and I can't express enough. Well, high quality is it's boardgametables.com.
It is super high quality.
Well,
but it's just
all play now, right?
yeah. So it's
that's right.
It's just all play now. Yeah, and it's just I can't express enough how awesome this game is. And I when I introduce it to people, most people don't know about it, and they get really excited. So you definitely want to check this game out. Simple on the surface. I mean, I even seen Heavy Cardboard play this game, and they were like, whoa, this game is a lot more going on than you think. So if you're looking for something that's real smart,
Super accessible.
and you can play it over and over again with your family, and you can make it as easy of a game as you want, or as like involved of a game as you want, because there's so many cards that set up different game conditions.
I have to get that expansion for the live stream. That's
I can tell you this. I will.
Hopefully you can get all that in the table, because you got to like snake it, depending on your table. It's a lot of pieces.
I will add this to his story. He was here just yesterday, and in fact, if you're a fan of MVM from back in the day, Gary was here with his son to pick up a couple games, and Jeremy literally brought this game up, then brought this game out, set the game up on the table really quickly, and then turned into the world's greatest family board game store manager. He was like selling this game like nobody's business. As you can tell, he's got it in his blood. But man, he set this thing up, and I have to say, I had rolled my eyes at this game when you brought it up in the past, but after he set it up and gave kind of the pitch, the pieces are, first of all,
those dual,
the components
triple
are
layer pieces.
unnecessarily amazing.
They're literally triple layered pieces.
And it's really cool. And those variable little cards that you can put out that change things up. Gave me almost Santorini vibes in terms of like, oh, wait a minute, the game's very different this time that we're playing. It was very
much. Now, like when I say like if you do, like we were setting it up, and it was like, hey, well, you can have this card where the ant does this and this and this and this. Like, I'm serious. There's ones where you're just like, I don't want to do all that. Like that you can get that amount out of the design.
Wow.
Or you can just go something like, all right, well, when this is here, it's -1 movement. Like you can
Pretty
make
vanilla.
it very vanilla, or you can literally have some of these very interesting obstacles, and you can switch it up every time, which is great.
So,
Jeremy, what's one other game? This is a total setup, by the way.
Are we allowed to talk about it?
Let me push this way. What's one more game that you've played recently?
So we played this Lost Species, Search for Lost Species game. This is a follow-up sequel to, it's a follow-up to Search for Planet X. It's a really interesting game where you are trying to find animals. And this is, instead of finding comments and all the other stuff like that, you're finding these animals while you're moving across this board. And it's got the same setup as far as like trying to find the same data, do research and things like that. But it does add some small changes, and you actually have this big board, and now you have multiple boards where you can find animals, and there's a more range of animals. So there's quite a bit going on in that game, and I just wanted to make sure you knew about it, and I want to share because I love that game so much, and you like the game a lot too.
Oh yeah, you don't want to miss this.
Yeah, you don't want to miss it. Yeah,
it's the follow-up to Search for Planet X,
which got missed.
That alone,
which got missed, and it's such a great game.
It's pretty amazing, and it does. You said it changes things up a little, but there are some things about the game
up a lot,
that considerably change how you interact with it in terms of spatially moving around this map, as opposed to not really doing that other than the time that's going around. That still is there, but you're actually on a map moving around into different regions.
I think people are just going to like the presentation of this game.
The presentation is
as a whole, just like what you're paying attention to, what you're looking at is just way more visually engaging.
Absolutely.
And the fact that you are physically moving around these pieces, little chunky guy, you're moving around.
Well, even the app looks better.
And the app is better.
The original app was good, but it was pretty sparse. It was very clean design.
That logic puzzle that was there in Search for Planet X is still intact.
For sure.
That is such a satisfying logic puzzle to solve, and the fact that Search for Lost Species gives you more different things to solve that logic puzzle by actually making you move around that spatial map.
And it has extra layers for sure.
It's
This
a
came
lot
out of nowhere
to think
too,
about.
so I'm just very surprised, and I was really excited about
Yeah, I
it.
didn't
So
know
I'm
this
gonna
was
lead into
coming
it.
at all.
Check out our coverage of it. I
Yeah.
don't want to go too deep because, of course, we got other coverage.
Not to mention, it melted my brain for sure. It was a little late, and these two guys were probably sitting there.
I wish I
thinking to
had
themselves,
pictures of him. Like,
Nope, I don't
Yeah,
want. I do not want those pictures made
It's like,
public.
what is this data?
I was
know.
like, this is too much for me this late at night. I was done.
He was fried.
But anyway, those are the games we've been playing, or in my case, trying to play. Let us know what you've been playing. Let us know what you think about player count in the comments below. And of course, as always, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you next time.